In one way or another, apart from the birth stories in Matthew and Luke, and the exalted prologue in the Gospel according to John, the story of Jesus' life in all four Gospels that we include in the New Testament begins with John the Baptist and his encounter with Jesus at the Jordan River. It begins with the affirmation of Jesus' unique identity by both God through a voice from heaven and the Spirit descending like a dove. And it's often said that the public ministry of Jesus begins after that, flows from the baptism. But that's not quite accurate, at least not in Matthew and Luke. The public ministry begins with Jesus preaching and teaching, and in Luke's version with miraculous healings, then continues on with the calling of the disciples. But between the baptism and that preaching and healing comes this temptation in the wilderness, as indicated in the gospel today and in Matthew and Luke as well. The version in Mark, as we see, is quite brief. We're more used to Matthew and Luke's version with specific temptations that, if not taken literally, elaborate various ways that we can all be drawn away from God. And Mark really takes that all in when he says, as Jesus say, or as the Gospels say, and the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. It was only after that experience, that encounter with other possibilities, that Jesus enters into his life in its wholeness, his life in its holiness. This time in the wilderness was just as important as the baptism, I think, for Jesus to become who he became. And examining that, I think we first need to understand that Satan isn't evil, at least not in this story, and not really in most of the places that Satan is mentioned in the Bible. Satan rather is the tempter. It's not the same thing. At least he begins by being the tempter. And that's the serpent's job, for example, in the Garden of Eden. You won't die, the serpent says. If you eat of the fruit that God said not to eat, you will be like God. And Satan is a central character in the book of Job in the same way. He does put all Job's afflictions upon him, but mostly as a test, as a temptation, to tempt Job to just give it all up, to curse God and die. It would be better than this, Satan says. And that's Satan's job here in this gospel today, in the wilderness with Jesus. Satan's not calling some kind of evil or pushing Jesus to evil to turn him to the dark side. When Luke and Matthew elaborate the temptations, they cite the temptations for material security, the bread from the stones, if you remember, the temptation of worldly power. All the kingdoms of the earth will be yours. We talk about wanting Jesus to be over the world. Even faith is a temptation, a showy, surface kind of faith, grant you, but throw yourself off the pinnacle of the temple and God's angels will catch you. Rather, Jesus is tempted to settle for less, to turn away from the struggle his calling requires, and just fit in to some stereotype values, stereotype goals in all of these ways. And those are the temptations that we face as well, mostly. Most of us aren't usually challenged to do evil things, but in one way or another, any situation we may find ourselves in can distort our true nature, can condition our love, can cloud our relationship with the source of our true being by trying to control our lives by themselves and not have any difficulty. I think that understanding of Satan as evil comes from a couple of places. Historically, it comes out of the dualistic religion of Persia that was a strong influence on the tradition of Judaism from the time of the exile in Babylon on. Shaitan, Satan, is a Persian character associated with evil. And Persian religions was dualistic as far as evil and good went. There was a good God and a bad God, separate and equal, engaged in a struggle for the universe in general and also for the human heart. Our sense of satanic evil also, I think, comes from the tendency to blame the messenger for the message. It turns a choice with which we're uncomfortable into a determinate cause. So it won't be our fault. The devil made me do it. Most dangerously, this sense of externalized evil in Satan or anywhere else really is a result of projection. We refuse to see the shadow in ourselves, so we find it in others and then try to destroy it. And we see that very clearly, I think, in the current divisions in our society. And these divisions, these wounds, can only be healed, really, if we reintegrate the whole moral spectrum that we've tried to divide. And if we allow our enemies that wholeness as well. And that can only happen if we're willing to acknowledge the complexity of God, the wholeness of God. If we're to be true monotheists, if we believe in one God, if what we believe is that reality is all connected and that God is the source, then what we know as evil also comes from God. It's a part of the picture. It's a part of the wholeness. In fact, evil may only take on what we experience as its fully oppressive and destructive nature if and when we try to separate good and evil from the rest of life. It's really a spectrum. And there's no clear line on which to divide it. If you take the whole spectrum, things work out because that's God's creation. If you try to manipulate it or suppress it or deny it, there's going to be trouble. We have to cope with that ambiguity. I heard a podcast the other day when I was walking down to pick up my car that had its first oil change after 11 and a half months. And it was about an African-American science fiction writer, a very interesting woman, who wrote a story about an African-American woman, I think it was in the 1970s, who was leading an exemplary life of true service to others, but was transported back to colonial Maryland to the life of a slave in order to save the life of her great-great-great-great-grandmother's rapist, who was a horrible person, but who needed to live if she herself was going to be born. It's complicated. I know that we can only make decisions that concern our moral actions in the moment that we're called to act. There's no theoretical practice that can teach us how to do it. There's no generalized rules that can specifically help. I think that's why we pray. What today's gospel tells us is not to just settle for some patterned prefab life, some fantasy we're attracted to, even a good one, even a good life. We have to live the life we're given with all its light and all its shadow, all that it entails. There's a framed calligraphy over on the church wall that I put up during Lent that was made by a monk that I knew at Mount Calvary Monastery down in Santa Barbara, and I got it from him. And it says, "Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by. Opportunity is lost. Each of us should strive to awaken. Take heed. Do not squander your life." We all need food. We all want faith. We all want the power to help us help the world. But all those are grounded, are based on the deeper and wider truth of our connection to all creation and our discernment of our calling and the particular part that we play in that creation. We usually don't know how that part fits in. That's not up to us. In this story, Jesus is brought to a moment of decision to reject the temptation to serve himself by accepting the call to truly be himself. Almost the same story is told of the Buddha. The same basic plot is in the Bhagavad Gita. It's a decision that we make again and again, facing our beasts, relying on angels. So have courage this Lent to face your whole truth, rejecting the lies that seem ubiquitous lately, the unchallenging fantasy that life should be easy and go the way we want, denying the shadow that's a part of who we are, and projecting our own darkness onto the enemy du jour. The things we want will come, or not. But what keeps us keep going amid all the struggle and all the temptation on our way of the cross is the loving grace of a loving God. And that is always available. Thanks be to God.